For 29-year-old Sherry Rasmussen, heading out to the movies on Sunday night with her husband seemed like the perfect ending to what had been, for them, an unusually nice weekend. The popular comedy they'd picked out for that night's entertainment, Down and Out in Beverly Hills, was just the answer to what John Ruetten called their Sunday night blues, that feeling that only one night's sleep stood between them and the start of their busy Monday to Friday work week. As Sherry opened the closet in their townhouse and pulled out their coats, she looked over at the 3 red roses John had given her that morning, 1 flower for each of the 3 months they had been married. Sherry had rearranged the roses in their slim glass vase and put them in the center of the dining room table where the flowers added a cheerful note of color. But seeing them now, Sherry couldn't keep from sighing. It was February 23, 1986, and Sherry and John had known one another for a total of 21 months. And Sherry had somehow expected that they would have worked out all their problems before they had exchanged wedding vows back on November 23rd. But that hadn't happened. Instead, the last 3 months had seemed to bring their differences in everything, from how they communicated to how they handled money, into sharper and sharper focus. And this evening, as the two of them got ready for the 40-minute drive to the movie theater north of their home in the Van Nuys neighborhood of Los Angeles, California, Sherry just hoped they could avoid a repeat of other times when they'd spent entire car rides arguing with each other. It was still hard for Sherry to forget one of their first getaways together as a married couple, a ski trip to Mammoth Mountain 5 hours away. From the time they had stepped out of their townhouse to the time they had arrived at the ski resort, Sherry had argued with John about money, and 2 months later, that was still a sore subject. The problem was not their income. They both had good jobs. Sherry was the director of critical care nursing at the Glendale Adventist Hospital, 25 minutes south of their home. 27-year-old John was a mechanical engineer who had just started a new job with a manufacturing company located 30 minutes north of their townhouse. Instead, the problem, as Sherry saw it, was that John had a taste for new and expensive cars, and he didn't mind at all going into debt to pay for them. There was the BMW he'd bought her in place of an engagement ring, and then there was the brand new 1986 Mazda RX-7 sports car that they'd be driving tonight to the movie theater. Sherry had always been someone who saved money. Despite growing up in comfortable circumstances in a comfortable neighborhood in Tucson, Arizona, Sherry's parents had been very strict about money. They had taught all 3 of their daughters to live within their means, and that meant doing things like not buying fancy cars you couldn't pay for with cash. On that trip to Mammoth Mountain, Sherry had told John that she was going to split up their bank accounts and set up a savings account in her own name. By the time they'd arrived at Mammoth, they'd been so upset and annoyed with each other that instead of skiing and spending a romantic overnight together, they just pulled into the resort parking lot, gone to the restrooms, piled back into the car, and driven 5 hours back home to Van Nuys. And now, all these weeks later, as Sherry and John walked down the stairway from inside of their 3-level townhouse into the garage on the floor level, there was another issue, even more troubling than finances and much harder to put into words, that had also begun to put a strain on Sherry's relationship with John. And that was Sherry's growing conviction that someone had recently begun to take a very, very keen interest in her and John. When Sherry had first told John about her feeling that they were being watched, and that Sherry sometimes felt like someone was actually following her, John had taken her concern seriously enough that back in December, they had installed a new security system inside of their townhouse. But instead of going away, Sherry's sense of uneasiness just seemed to get worse. At the same time, whenever she tried to bring the subject up to John, she felt like he was starting not to believe her. Now, as Sherry opened the front passenger seat and slipped inside the sports car, she promised herself that she was not going to let her annoyance with John spoil the 3-month anniversary that had started that morning with his gift of roses. Instead, Sherry forced herself to think about what a nice day she and John had just had. After she and John had eaten a leisurely breakfast together, they'd been joined by Sherry's younger sister and her husband Brian, who made the hour-and-a-half drive west to Van Nuys from Loma Linda. Sherry had let her brother-in-law drive her new silver BMW, while Sherry enjoyed fussing over Teresa, who was 5 months pregnant with her first child. And after Brian and Teresa had left, Sherry, who loved all outdoor sports and activities, had gone for a long run. And when she got back, she and John had yet another visitor. Mike Buldrick was one of several of her husband's old college friends, ex-girlfriends, and dorm mates that Sherry had met since she started dating John. While not all of those people had become Sherry's friends, her smile when she got back from her run and saw Mike was genuinely warm and welcome. Mike had been one of the groomsmen at Sherry and John's wedding back in November, and no matter what had happened since then in Sherry and John's life, that day in late fall had been such a happy occasion for all of them. Now, as John started the car engine and backed the Mazda out of the garage, Sherry wondered whether John ever talked to Mike or anyone else about things like money or Sherry's safety concerns. But looking now over at John's untroubled face, Sherry decided he probably didn't, because to John, they weren't really his problems. They were Sherry's problems. Turning her gaze back to the road in front of them, Sherry hardly noticed the neighborhoods and towns she and John were passing on their scenic route to Simi Valley. Glamorous places like Beverly Hills and Malibu and Pasadena, places that had made her adopted home state of California famous throughout the world. Instead, what Sherry was seeing in her mind's eye was the face of that person who was staring at her and John when they were out eating dinner recently at a local restaurant, and then melting out of sight immediately after locking eyes with Sherry. And instead of hearing the sound of traffic as the maroon Mazda sped north, Sherry heard the sound of the phone calls once and sometimes twice a week, and then a click whenever Sherry or John actually picked up the receiver to say hello. John could say what he wanted to about there being a problem with the phone line, but Sherry wasn't buying it. And the more Sherry felt like John was dismissing her concerns, the more Sherry had started to confide about her fears and the issues in her marriage, not to John, but to her friends and to her parents. And in particular, Sherry had found that her father, Nels Rasmussen, was taking every one of her conversations very seriously. Nels had always been especially protective of his middle daughter, the child who was so smart she'd been enrolled in college at the age of 16, and who turned heads everywhere she went thanks to her physical beauty, and to the fact that she was a full 6 feet tall in stocking feet. And Nels was equally proud of how his joyful and playful youngster had grown up into a kind, independent, and fun-loving young woman whose sense of adventure and ambition had taken her from Tucson, Arizona, out to the bright lights and big city of Los Angeles. Nels was also less worried about Sherry's difference with John over money than he was about Sherry's other harder-to-define fears about being watched and maybe even threatened. Nels might not know all the details of Sherry's marriage and life, but he did know his daughter was not prone to imagining things or having anxiety attacks for no reason. Nels had also sensed in his latest phone conversations with his daughter that Sherry, who had always been a person of action, had come to some kind of a decision. And, as Nels later reported to his wife, he had the distinct impression that with or without John's support or involvement, Sherry was going to take steps of her own to resolve the strains she was feeling in her marriage, and to make sure that both inside and outside of her townhouse, she felt safe and free from any prying eyes. By the time John and Sherry had pulled into the parking lot surrounding the brightly lit movie theater, the hypnotic motion of freeway driving had worked its magic, and Sherry had finally relaxed. And when John stepped around to her side of the car to open the door for her, she gave him that radiant smile that never failed to take his breath away. A few hours later, their hands still buttery from the bag of popcorn they had shared, Sherry and John were stepping out of the crowded movie theater into the darkness and making their way through the busy parking lot back to their car. The movie had lived up to its good reviews, and the story about a rich couple whose stale marriage and lives are changed by the arrival of a homeless vagrant had made both Sherry and John laugh. But as Sherry settled into the passenger seat of the Mazda for the drive home, she suddenly found herself thinking about the husband in the film, who was having an affair with the couple's live-in maid. Looking over at John, Sherry reminded herself of the very direct conversations she and John had had before getting married about always being able to trust one another. As for John, from the moment he had met Sherry almost 2 years ago at a party hosted by a mutual friend, all other women in his life had been instantly forgotten about, and the good-looking engineer with the dark hair and white teeth had fallen hook, line, and sinker for the tall, friendly, and vivacious nurse who was now his wife. Turning to smile at Sherry, John put the key into the ignition, turned on the engine, and a few minutes later, they had joined the river of cars that flowed south down the freeway into Los Angeles. By 10 p.m. that night, Sherry and John were walking up the stairway that led from their 2-car garage up to their 3-level townhouse. Stopping in the living room, they locked the door behind them and put away their jackets. Then they walked up the short flight of stairs that led into their kitchen and dining room, and the two of them chatted while John put together a lunch that he would take to work the next day. One more short flight of stairs, and they had reached their master bedroom and bath on the 3rd level. As they were both getting ready for bed, Sherry told John that she was dreading a class about conflict resolutions she was scheduled to teach at work the next day, and that she was thinking about calling out sick. Just before the two of them turned out the light and slipped off to sleep, John urged Sherry to just go in and teach the class and get it over with. But when the couple woke up just before 7 a.m. the next morning, Monday, February 12th, only John got out of bed to shower and dress. Still tucked under the blanket, Sherry told John that she'd decided she was going to stay home. Before leaving the house, John said yes, he'd be sure to give Sherry a call later that morning to check in on her, and by 7:20, he was locking the living room door behind him and walking down the stairs into the garage, where he opened the door of his Mazda and hopped inside. As John backed his car out of the garage, he paused just long enough to hit the remote button that would close the garage door behind him. 10 hours later, John was hopping back into his car to make the 30-minute drive back home to Balboa Townhomes, this time stopping just long enough to pick up some clothes from the dry cleaner. True to his word, John had called Sherry that morning from his office, twice in fact, and when Sherry didn't answer either call, John had checked in with Sherry's secretary at Glendale Adventist Hospital to see if maybe Sherry had decided to go to work that day after all. And as far as Sherry's secretary knew, without having actually seen Sherry that morning, the answer to John's question was yes, she had gone to work. What John wouldn't find out until later was that that information was wrong. By noon, when Sherry's sister, Teresa, had made her usual call to Sherry, Sherry's secretary told Teresa that Sherry had called out sick. So it wasn't until John pulled into the driveway of Unit 205 and noticed that the garage door was open and that Sherry's BMW was gone that he felt the first flicker of worry. That worry intensified when he saw broken glass scattered on the driveway. So after pulling his Mazda into the garage and turning off the engine, John only stopped long enough to grab the pile of clean clothes before he stepped out of the car and hurried through the door at the back of the garage that led up to their living room. Distracted by the thoughts of the broken glass and missing BMW, John didn't notice the dark red flecks on the staircase wall next to him. But an instant later, John's attention snapped fully back to the present. Right in front of him, at the top of the stairs from the garage, he could see that the door into the living room of Unit 205 was wide open. And right inside, lying on her back in the middle of their living room floor, John saw his wife, Sherry. And he knew instantly that something terrible had happened. His wife's beautiful face was unrecognizable. One eye stared sightlessly upward, the other eye was swollen shut and crusted with blood. The rest of Sherry's face was dark with bruises. Wearing a short red robe over her sleeveless undershirt and panties, Sherry's right arm looked frozen in place with her hand raised stiffly towards the ceiling. Her left hand lay across her chest, her wedding band shining dully on her long, slender finger. All around Sherry, there were smears of blood and signs of a terrible struggle. Electrical cords and wires snaked across the floor, most of them leading to the stereo equipment that was stacked in a messy pile right next to the door where John was now standing. Carefully laying his armload of clothes over the back of the sofa, John took a few slow steps towards Sherry's body. Then, with the toe of his shoe, he reached out and touched the stiff, cold flesh of his wife's bare leg. A moment later, John had picked up the phone that had been knocked to the floor and dialed 911. When the emergency dispatch operator at the Los Angeles police station answered the call and asked John the nature of his emergency, his voice was flat with shock. "I think my wife is dead." And then, after giving his address and ending the call, John pulled a hand towel out of a small cupboard, walked back over to Sherry's body, and draped the towel over her ruined face. As John would tell the first medics who arrived on the scene 8 minutes later, the sight of Sherry's facial injuries was so upsetting that John never even noticed the 3 bullet holes in Sherry's chest or the bite mark on the inside of her left forearm. By 8 p.m., so 1 hour and 45 minutes after first responders had arrived inside of Unit 205, the lead detective on the Sherry Rasmussen murder case had also arrived on the scene. While the crime scene techs were busy taking pictures and marking the location of pieces of evidence, Detective Lyle Mayer joined his junior partner and the head of the Van Nuys Homicide Bureau to do a walkthrough of the crime scene. As the husband of the victim and as the person who first discovered Sherry's body, John was automatically a person of interest, and the detective planned to question John at the police station as soon as investigators finished this initial examination of each room in the townhouse. The investigator also knew that it would take days and even weeks before all the evidence collected from the scene would be fully cataloged, tested, and analyzed. But even without all that information yet to come, at the end of an hour, Detective Mayer and his two colleagues had formed what Mayer believed was a very strong theory about the cause of Sherry's death. Starting with the stack of stereo equipment next to the door and the apparent theft of Sherry's expensive BMW car from the garage, it looked to Detective Mayer like Sherry had been the victim of a burglary that had gone tragically wrong. And 2 hours later, after questioning Sherry's husband John at the Van Nuys police station, Detective Mayer had not discovered any information that seemed to contradict that theory. During his interview with the detective, John had been obviously upset over his wife's death, often breaking down in tears as he answered one question after another. But over the course of the interview, John was able to give the lead investigator, a 20-year veteran of the Los Angeles Police Department, a complete account of John's last conversation with Sherry before John left for work that morning, and also a complete account of where and how John himself had spent the day. And when John described exactly what he had done before leaving the house for work that morning, the detective was also sure he just figured out why there was no sign of forced entry at the crime scene. According to John, while he had locked the door of the townhouse that led into the garage stairway, he had not checked the front door or armed the security system. It now seemed likely to the detective that all the attacker or burglar had to do to get inside the townhouse was just turn the front doorknob and walk right inside. And no, John told the detective, he and Sherry did not keep a gun in their house. No, John had never and would never hurt Sherry. No, they had no enemies. And finally, absolutely no, there were no problems or issues with their marriage. No disagreements about money, no ex-girlfriends or ex-boyfriends, no unexpected or unwanted visitors, and no unusual calls, just a technical glitch that had caused their phone to ring, even though when he or Sherry answered, the line was always dead. Crying, John told the detective that he and Sherry had just celebrated their 3rd-month anniversary of their marriage. Quote, "We just got married," John said. "We were having the best time." End quote. Meanwhile, as John's interview was wrapping up, back at Balboa Townhomes, the senior coroner was examining Sherry's body, and John's parents were finishing the 3.5-hour drive from their home in San Diego up to Van Nuys. And by the time the coroner had ordered Sherry's body transported from her home to the county morgue for an autopsy, John and his parents were checking in to the local Travelodge motel. At 1 a.m., almost 7 hours after John had discovered Sherry's dead body inside of their townhouse, John asked his father to call Sherry's family and tell them that Sherry had been murdered. At 1 p.m. in the afternoon of April 10th, 1986, so 6.5 weeks after Sherry Rasmussen's murder, Detective Mayer got the break in his investigation that he'd been hoping for, the one that he was sure confirmed his theory that Sherry had been killed in the course of a robbery gone wrong. It was also a break that Detective Mayer hoped would help him do what he'd so far failed to do, which was to make an arrest and close the books on this homicide. Not that the lead investigator hadn't made significant progress since receiving that 911 call from Unit 205 on the night of Monday, February 24th. Over the last 46 days, the police had gathered witness statements and done interviews that allowed the detective and his team to narrow the time of Sherry's murder to sometime between 7:30 and 10 in the morning. police had also been able to identify the type of gun that was used to fire the 3 shots that had actually ended Sherry's life, as well as shattered the door to the balcony, scattering the broken pieces of glass that John had seen in the driveway on the evening that he had discovered Sherry's body. Police had also recovered Sherry's missing purse, apparently just thrown away not far from the murder scene, as well as her stolen silver BMW, which was found 11 days after the murder, undamaged with the keys in the ignition. In addition to providing police with his alibi, John Ruetten had agreed to take a lie detector test, and while he was too emotional for the results of that test to be conclusive, Detective Mayer felt comfortable crossing him off the suspect list. The most frustrating part of the last 6 weeks had been the detective's interaction with Sherry's father, Nels Rasmussen, who had arrived in Van Nuys the day after Sherry's murder, accompanied by his wife and Sherry's 2 sisters. Nels, a logger and woodsman turned successful dentist, was all about the questions he thought the detective had not asked, like why had John and Sherry installed that security system in the first place? What were they afraid of? And why weren't detectives questioning John Ruetten's ex-girlfriends? And why weren't police following up on Sherry's complaints to Nels that she was being followed by someone? And why couldn't John seem to recall any of these arguments he'd been having with his wife over money? And over Sherry's conviction that someone was openly watching them. The detective had been very happy when Nels and his family had left Los Angeles after just 3 days to head back to Tucson, Arizona, where they would bury their daughter at a family-only service on March 2nd, just 8 days after her death. But now, 1.5 months later, Detective Mayer wouldn't have minded having a quick conversation with Nels Rasmussen, because the police report that had just landed on the detective's desk looked like it answered every single one of Nels' loudly expressed doubts over Mayer's theory that burglars had killed his daughter. The report detailed a robbery that had happened earlier that day, just 2 blocks from the townhouse where Sherry had been murdered 1.5 months earlier. Except this time, the woman who had surprised the robbers while they were in the act of ransacking her home, she had not been killed or injured. Instead of confronting her, the robbers had fled, leaving a stack of her expensive stereo equipment next to an exit door and driving off in a blue station wagon they'd parked at the curb. Despite these differences in the 2 crimes, one ended in murder and the theft of a getaway vehicle, while the other did not, Detective Mayer could almost hear the click in his mind as all the pieces of his burglar theory in the Sherry Rasmussen murder investigation fell into place. And this time, he had an eyewitness, a victim who had been able to tell police what the intruders looked like. By late afternoon, police had linked that recent burglary to Sherry's murder, and they had released police sketches of 2 Hispanic men that were now considered likely suspects in both crimes. But over the next few months, despite police detaining and questioning a handful of men and known criminals who matched those descriptions, Detective Mayer and his team were never able to identify and charge the robbers who broke into the condo near Sherry's house, or pull in any other suspects who could be linked to the Sherry Rasmussen murder. Instead, by the end of May, 86 days after Sherry's murder, the investigation into her death went cold. Over the next 19 years, the case file of the Sherry Rasmussen murder would be reviewed 3 more times. And in 1991, when Detective Mayer retired from the Los Angeles Police Department, the case would be handed over to a new lead investigator. And during all those years, John Ruetten would move on with his life. He never went back to live in the townhouse he had shared with Sherry, and unlike Sherry's father, Nels, John rarely contacted police to offer any additional information, check in on the investigation, or to urge police to try new leads in solving Sherry's murder. In 1990, John took a trip to Hawaii where he ran into an old college friend, and the 2 of them enjoyed a short romantic holiday together before going their separate ways. And by 1993, John had met and married the woman who would become his second wife. It wasn't until February 2009, 23 years after Sherry's death, that Los Angeles homicide detectives would finally get the tip they needed to break the Sherry Rasmussen murder case wide open. On Monday, February 2nd, the day after the 2009 Super Bowl football game, Detective Jim Nuttall found a box of files on murder investigations called murder books waiting for him on his desk when he arrived at work. These were cases so old and so cold that his job was to review and organize them before sending them into deep storage. The first book he pulled out of the box was the file on Sherry's 1986 murder. But on what should have been a quick and final read-through of the case, the detective's attention was riveted by the results of a DNA test that had come back 4 years earlier in 2005. That DNA analysis, along with several other details of the crime scene, blew huge holes in the theory that Sherry's death had been a burglary gone wrong. And before long, Detective Nuttall, with the help of a new team of investigators, had a list of 5 new suspects in Sherry's murder. And just 3 months later, investigators had narrowed that list to just one name. On June 3, 2009, a special surveillance unit of the Los Angeles Police Force was trailing this one suspect into a popular big box retail store called Costco, located in Simi Valley, the same area where Sherry and her husband John had gone to the movies together on the night before Sherry was killed. Like so many other shoppers at Costco, their target had stopped at the store's outdoor food court for lunch. The team watched as their target drank from a straw stuck into a cup of soda. And when their target had finished eating and tossed that cup of soda into a trash can on the way out of the food court, it was only a matter of seconds before the team had whisked the cup and the straw, with its precious load of their suspect's saliva and DNA, into a manila envelope, returned to their vehicles out in the parking lot, and driven south to hand-deliver the package to the Los Angeles Police Department Special Investigations Division. 2 days later, on Friday, June 5th, police brought that suspect in for questioning. What they would discover over the course of a 4-hour interrogation, coupled with new DNA tests and a review of the old murder book on Sherry Rasmussen, would send shockwaves throughout the city of Los Angeles. Based on those findings, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the day that Sherry Rasmussen was murdered over 23 years earlier. Monday, February 24, 1986, was a beautiful winter day in Van Nuys, California. By 7:30 in the morning, the temperature was on its way up from cool to warm without being hot. The sky was clear and the air was still. But standing outside the Balboa Boulevard townhouses, Sherry's killer hardly noticed the nice weather. They were too busy watching for John Rutan's car to leave the gated complex so they could get busy with that morning's work. And sure enough, a few minutes before 7:30, there was the maroon Mazda easing out onto Balboa Boulevard and about to turn north for the 30 minutes drive to John's office. To the killer, the daily routines of this newly married couple were as familiar as the killer's own routines. After all, the killer had been spending months watching them, especially after finding out about their engagement back in May of 1984. Even before that, though, the killer had begun to keep careful notes about where and when the killer had observed either John or Sherry, including the visits the killer had made to their townhouse, the restaurants where the killer had watched them together, and the gym where Sherry went to take aerobics classes. Sherry's killer even took pleasure in knowing that Sherry was aware that she was being watched, and that Sherry so obviously disliked the killer, especially after their confrontation at Sherry's place of work back in August of 1985, 3 months after the couple's engagement. But as of today, Sherry's killer was done watching. Patting their pocket, the killer felt the weight and shape of the .38 caliber revolver with the short barrel, along with the length of cord the killer could use to tie Sherry's hands or feet. As for getting into Unit 205, that should be easy. Even if the doors were locked, it would not be the first time that the killer had let themselves in using the keypad. And a few minutes later, before Sherry was supposed to leave for work, the killer, silent as a ghost, was standing inside the living room. After taking a moment to get their bearings, the killer crossed the tile and carpet to walk up the short flight of stairs to the next level where the dining room, kitchen, and small breakfast room were located. And that is where Sherry, walking down from her bedroom, dressed in her short red robe, underwear top, and black panties, found her attacker. And that is where Sherry began to fight for her life. The murderer's first 2 gunshots missed their target, and instead of hitting Sherry, they passed through a curtain and shattered the sliding glass door leading out to the patio. As soon as the killer had raised the weapon, Sherry had turned and made a run for the stairs leading down to the living room and to the panic button that was located in the alarm panel next to the front door. But Sherry's killer was strong and fast, and before Sherry could make it to the door, the killer was on her. Everything about the crime scene, along with the medical examiner's autopsy report, would testify to just how close Sherry would come to disarming and possibly defeating her attacker. In the struggle that followed, the entertainment wall unit collapsed, the phone fell to the floor, wires were ripped out of sockets, lamps fell over, and crime scene techs would find 2 of Sherry's torn fingernails on the floor near the security panel, along with a single bloody handprint where Sherry had come so close to hitting the alarm. At some point, police believe that Sherry actually managed to get control of the murderer's gun and put her attacker into a headlock. It was at that point that the killer bit the inside of Sherry's left forearm to break free, and then grabbed hold of a nearby ceramic vase that the killer brought down with all their force onto Sherry's forehead. Stunned, Sherry crumpled to the floor. Regaining control of the gun, the killer leaned down and pressed the weapon directly into Sherry's chest and fired the first of 3 shots. Then, the killer paused long enough to grab a quilt from off a nearby chair, wrap the thick blanket around the muzzle of the gun to deaden the sound, aim the weapon again at Sherry's chest, and fire 2 more shots. At some point in the struggle, ligature marks on Sherry's arms just above the wrists indicated that she had been tied with a cord that was left at the scene of the crime. Her hands, head, and neck would be covered with defensive wounds, bruises, cuts, and scratches, but the most severe damage to Sherry's face, the damage that would be so upsetting to John Ruetten that he would cover his wife's face with a hand towel after calling 911, had been caused by blunt trauma, not just from being struck with the vase, but by being struck at least twice in the face with the butt of a gun. When the killer was sure that Sherry was dead, they stood for a moment over her body, letting their breathing return to normal. Then the killer looked around the room, taking in the damage, remembering the 3 roses in a vase on the dining room table on the next level, and planning how to arrange everything in the townhouse so it would appear to police that Sherry had been killed in a robbery gone wrong. It didn't take much work. All the killer had to do was knock over a few more small items of furniture, pull the drawer out of an end table, and put the stereo equipment in a stack by the door. Then the killer rifled through Sherry's belongings until they found her purse with her wallet and her marriage license inside, as well as the keys to her silver BMW. As the killer left the living room to walk down the stairs into the garage, they left small flecks of Sherry's blood on the wall. What the killer did not realize was that they had also left one of their own bloody fingerprints on the stack of stereo equipment next to the townhouse door, as well as a sample of their saliva embedded in the bite wound on Sherry's left arm. A few minutes later, and the killer had slid behind the driver's wheel of Sherry's engagement car, turned on the engine, and backed out the driveway. The killer left the garage door open as they drove out of the Balboa townhouse complex. 3 years later, the killer would finally meet up again with Sherry's widower, John Ruetten, on a vacation in Hawaii. But a relationship that the killer had hoped would end in love and marriage would only last for a few days. And then John would go back to his new home in San Diego and meet a new woman who would eventually become his second wife. Just as John had left the killer once before, years ago, for the beautiful and radiant Sherry Rasmussen. After kissing John goodbye in Hawaii, Sherry's killer, best known to John as the on-again, off-again sexual partner he had met back in college, packed her bags and headed home to Los Angeles. And once there, Sherry's killer, up-and-coming Los Angeles Police Department detective Stephanie Lazarus, did her best to put both John, a man she had loved obsessively since 1978, and Sherry, the romantic rival she had gunned down on February 23, 1986, out of her mind. It would turn out that all of Sherry Rasmussen's fears about being followed were true. But as far as Sherry was concerned, from the very beginning, there had been very little doubt about who that stalker was and why this woman was harassing Sherry. Because back in June of 1985, just weeks after Sherry and John had announced their engagement, Sherry had gotten a visit from an off-duty police officer named Stephanie Lazarus, who told Sherry point blank, quote, "If I can't have John, you can't either." End quote. Stephanie, who had shown up in Sherry's office at work, dressed in very tight short shorts and a tank top that showed off her very fit body, then went on to tell Sherry that Stephanie and John, who had met 15 years earlier at the University of California in Los Angeles, were still having sex with one another, and that if Sherry's marriage failed, Stephanie would be right there to pick up the pieces. And when Sherry confronted John about this visit from Stephanie and what Stephanie had told her, John confessed that it was true. That after finding out about his engagement to Sherry, Stephanie had called John in tears and asked him to come visit and comfort her. John had agreed, and he also agreed to have what he described to Sherry as, quote, closure sex with Stephanie. John also insisted that Stephanie might think she was his girlfriend, but as far as John was concerned, they were just more like sex buddies. John promised Sherry he would end things with Stephanie, but instead of contacting Stephanie directly and making it clear to her that he was not ever interested in a romantic relationship, John just cut off all communication on his end without telling Stephanie why. Meanwhile, Stephanie, somehow bypassing the townhouse security system, started to show up at John and Sherry's unit, dropping off skis for John to wax or popping in to say hi to John. When Sherry objected to this, John refused to take any action. Instead, he told his wife to, quote, just let this die, end quote. By the time Sherry and John were celebrating their 3-month wedding anniversary on Sunday, February 23rd, Sherry's father, Nels, had the impression that Sherry was so frustrated and unhappy that she had decided to take steps of her own to resolve the situation with John's ex-girlfriend, a woman who she had only described to Nels as a cop with the Los Angeles Police Department. Sherry could have no way of knowing that Stephanie had also decided to resolve the situation, and on the morning of the following day, Monday, February 24th, Stephanie Lazarus would accomplish that by murdering her ex-boyfriend's wife and making the crime look like a robbery gone wrong. But if Sherry expected that she would become the next Mrs. Rutan, she was wrong. John would meet up with Stephanie for a fling in Hawaii, but other than that, their relationship ended with Sherry's death. Still, it wasn't until 2005, 19 years after the murder, that Stephanie's perfect cover-up of that murder started to unravel. That's when investigators who were reviewing the case happened to stumble across a piece of evidence that had apparently been misplaced, the swab taken from the bite wound on Sherry's arm. Using DNA tests that had not been available in 1986, investigators discovered that the DNA on that swab showed that Sherry's killer was a female. But when the DNA profile did not match any known offenders in the National DNA Database, police once again closed the investigation. It wouldn't be until February 2009, 4 years later, that Detective Jim Nuttall would review the Sherry Rasmussen murder book and understand the real significance of that DNA finding. If Sherry's killer was a single female, then the original theory about the murderer being 2 male suspects was wrong. There was also a picture of a bloody fingerprint on the stack of stereo equipment found by the door of Sherry's living room, suggesting that the equipment had been stacked after and not before the murder had happened. And just like that, Nels Rasmussen's unshakable conviction that his daughter's killer was one of John's ex-girlfriends suddenly looked very likely. And going back almost 23 years, Nels had already put a name to that girlfriend, LAPD Detective Stephanie Lazarus. And by June of 2009, Stephanie Lazarus was number 1 on Detective Nuttall's suspect list too. As he took a closer look at one of LAPD's star detectives, now assigned to art theft detail, the circumstantial evidence kept mounting up. On the day of Sherry's murder, Stephanie had taken the day off, and the weapon used to kill Sherry matched the description of a gun that Stephanie would report stolen 10 days after the murder. There were also the irregularities that the detective had discovered in the case file itself, like someone with police-level access to the murder book had removed any reports or paperwork that contained Stephanie's name, including the handwritten notes and chronology that detailed the entire first 3 months of the Rasmussen investigation. On June 3rd, a surveillance unit that had been following Officer Lazarus collected a DNA sample from a cup Stephanie had thrown away while eating lunch at Costco. And 2 days later, the DNA analysis of that saliva would prove to be a match to the DNA of the killer who had bitten Sherry's inner arm. Stephanie's DNA would also match tissue collected from under Sherry's broken fingernails. On June 5, 2009, Stephanie Lazarus was arrested at the Los Angeles Police Headquarters and charged with the 1986 murder of Sherry Rasmussen. When police searched Stephanie's house shortly after the arrest, they would find a 600-page-long journal that included passages detailing Stephanie's relationship with John and how closely she had watched John and Sherry. Police would also find a well-worn picture taken back in 1979 of John sleeping in his dorm room at college. On the back, in Stephanie's handwriting, was this inscription, quote, "I snuck in at 1 a.m. and took this photo," end quote. In 2012, 3 years after her arrest, Stephanie Lazarus would be found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Sherry Rasmussen, and she would be sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. In the early 1990s, a woman in her early 20s, named Krista Frater, was working as a manager inside of a retail store called the Boston Store in Madison, Wisconsin. Not long after she was hired there, the Boston Store would hire another employee to work at their Madison location. His name was Bart Halderson, and like Krista, he was in his early 20s, although he was 3 years younger than Krista, and he was hired to be a clerk. Bart and Krista didn't know each other before working at the same location, but their shifts often overlapped, and so in time they got to know each other, and they found they had a lot in common. They both had grown up roughly outside of Madison, Wisconsin. They both had graduated from the same college, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and they both shared a love of home design. Krista, who had majored in art history in college, was very passionate about interior home design. As for Bart, he was just one of those people who naturally could fix just about anything with his bare hands, and growing up, his favorite projects were anything to do with home repairs. Whether it was something super simple or super complex, he didn't care. He just found it incredibly satisfying to keep a home in immaculate condition. And so Bart and Krista bonded over their commonalities, and in time, their working friendship evolved into a full-fledged romance. And by 1994, they had left the Boston Store, they had gotten married, and they had moved in together to their own apartment in DeForest, Wisconsin, which is not far from Madison. 2 years after that, in 1996, Bart and Krista welcomed their first child into the world. It was a little boy who they named Mitchell. And as soon as Mitchell was born, Krista decided she wanted to stay home with the baby, and Bart was in full support, and so he went out and he got a great job as an accountant, which paid enough money to pay for the whole family. And 18 months after Mitchell was born, Bart and Krista welcomed their second and final child, another boy who they named Chandler. A few years after Chandler was born, Bart and Krista had saved up just enough money that they could finally afford to buy a house of their own. And the house they finally settled on was just this very modest, small 2-story home in this very quiet little town in Wisconsin called Windsor. Windsor is not far from DeForest, where they had been renting an apartment. But this little house in Windsor was perfect for Bart, Krista, and their boys. Not only did it have enough space for the family, but because it was their own house, as soon as they moved in, Krista got to really lean in to her passion for interior design, and she got to design the entire layout of the house. And then she continued to take pride in keeping the house perfectly tidy and beautiful at all times. As for Bart, he immediately began doing home repair project after home repair project. This house became his trophy, and he wanted to make sure his trophy was polished at all times. And it wasn't just the physical house that made this feel like their forever home. It was also their neighbors. As soon as they moved in, Bart and Krista made friends with all of the people that lived on their street, and they were all so friendly and welcoming. And then before long, the Haldersons were deeply invested in community activities like the Boy Scouts and the Kiwanis Club, and they were donating their time and money to other charities. I mean, so quickly, the Halderson family just found where they belonged. And over the next 2+ decades, life for the Haldersons in this little home in Windsor remained perfect. Bart continued to move up the ladder at his accounting firm, and Krista continued to be a devoted mother and housekeeper. As for the kids, Mitchell and Chandler, they were given every opportunity their parents could possibly give them, and in that loving and supportive environment, they both thrived. By 2021, the older brother, Mitchell, who was 25 at the time, he had moved out and was living alone in an apartment, and he had graduated from college. He had landed an incredible IT job with a local, very successful company. He was engaged to be married, and he was about to buy his own house. As for the younger brother, Chandler, who was 23 at the time, he was still living at home with Bart and Krista, but he was doing just as well as his older brother. He was in his final year of college, but he had already accepted a full-time job with SpaceX that was set to start in Florida as soon as he graduated. And while he was in his final year of college, in between his studies, he worked part-time at a local insurance company to help pay rent to his parents, and he also volunteered the rest of his spare time with the Madison Police Department on their rescue scuba diving team. Chandler was also in a committed relationship with his girlfriend. But despite how well everything was going for Bart, for Krista, for Mitchell, for Chandler, their lives were about to take a serious turn for the worst. It all started in June of 2021. That month, Chandler, who was only weeks away from flying out to Titusville, Florida to start his job with SpaceX, fell down an entire flight of stairs, smashing his head in the process. Now, he immediately picked himself up and tried to tell himself that he was okay, but over the course of that day, he started to feel woozy and disoriented, and his legs started to feel numb. And so in a panic, he rushed himself to the hospital, and unfortunately, when they scanned his brain and they checked him out, the doctors discovered he had a severe concussion from this fall, and he had a brain bleed that almost certainly would require surgery at some point down the road. Also, the numbness in his legs appeared to be the result of permanent nerve damage. And so suddenly, Chandler, who was so excited about this opportunity in Florida, is now back home in a neck brace with a cane to get around. And even with the cane, he can barely walk. And then adding insult to injury, he almost immediately lost the job at SpaceX because he couldn't travel to Florida to start the job, and so they filled it with someone else. Chandler did his best to stay positive and optimistic, but I mean, this was a crushing blow. Everything he had worked for had just been taken away. And it was crushing for his family too. I mean, seeing their beloved Chaz, as they called him, laying on the couch looking totally miserable and depressed all day was awful. But despite how bad Chandler's accident was, the trauma it inflicted on Chandler and his family was nothing compared to what happened next. The Haldersons owned a small cabin that was located in a part of Wisconsin called White Lake. It was located about 3 hours drive to the north of their home in Windsor, and the cabin was situated inside of this rural forested area right near a big lake called White Lake, hence the name of the area. This cabin had been in the Halderson family since the 1940s, and when Mitchell and Chandler were little kids, Bart and Krista would take them up there all the time to go fishing, to go swimming, or just to relax. It was like their vacation home. But at some point, Chandler and Mitchell reached a certain age where they weren't that interested in going to the cabin anymore, and so as a result, Bart and Krista basically stopped going. However, just 2 weeks after Chandler's horrific injury, there was this huge storm that rolled through the White Lake area, and after the storm had passed, some people who lived permanently in White Lake called Bart and Krista and told them, hey, I was driving past your cabin and I saw there was some broken windows. It looks like your cabin might have been damaged from this storm. And so Bart and Krista, they're thinking, oh my goodness, we got to get up there as soon as we can and patch up that window and fix the rest of the cabin before another storm rolls through and totally ruins the cabin. And so Bart and Krista pull out their calendar and they see the next weekend coming up is the 4th of July weekend. The 4th of July is a very big holiday in America. It's when we celebrate our independence. And the way White Lake celebrates the 4th of July is with a big parade down Main Street and these amazing fireworks out over White Lake. And so Bart and Krista, they figure, you know what, let's just hold off and head up to our cabin happen in a couple of days to time it with the 4th of July weekend, and we can make the necessary repairs, and we can enjoy the festivities of the holiday and kind of have a mini vacation up there. And so that was all fine and good, but right before they left for this trip up to White Lake, Bart and Krista started acting a little weird. On the evening of Thursday, July 1st, the day before Bart and Krista are supposed to leave for this trip, they begin packing up their things. And since Chandler lives with them, he's at home, he sees them doing this, and at some point he kind of got up and hobbled over and tried to help them pack, but that was short-lived because his legs were so weak. And so he sat down and just kind of watched them pack. And what he saw is they were packing lots and lots of cash and silver bars into their luggage. Although this was kind of odd to Chandler, he decided not to say anything because he figured, you know what, maybe they want to stash their cash and silver in the cabin like a keepsake, I don't know, but it's their business, it's not mine. And so Bart and Krista, they continue to pack up their things, and Chandler, because he can't go anywhere, just continues to kind of watch them pack. And at some point, Chandler asks his parents, so how are you getting up to White Lake? And his parents would say, oh, we're just getting a ride from our friends, another couple, they're driving us up. But they didn't tell him who the couple was. They basically just said, it's our friends. And so again, Chandler's sitting there thinking, okay, this whole thing is a little bit weird, but you know what? It's their business. I'm not going to ask about it. They obviously don't want to tell me. And so he just kind of let it go. And so at some point, Bart and Krista, they finish packing and they move all their luggage to the front of the house right near the front door. And then a little while later, they and Chandler would retreat to their rooms and they would go to sleep. The next morning, July 2nd, Friday, Chandler got up early at about 6 a.m. And when he got up, he began slowly hobbling his way down the stairs, expecting to see his mom and dad having breakfast and, getting ready to leave because they certainly wouldn't have left without telling him. But he gets downstairs and the house is dark and totally empty, and all of the bags that his parents had packed the night before and put near the front door, they were all gone. And so Chandler's thinking, did my parents get up at like 5 a.m. and leave without telling me? And so he goes to the door and he looks out the window thinking, maybe they're out there waiting outside. But when he looked outside, his parents weren't out there. And sure enough, their cars were still in the driveway. And so Chandler was left to believe that, well, I guess my parents did get picked up by whoever these friends were, and they did not feel the need to come tell me they were leaving. Now, this did leave Chandler a little bit shaken up. He just kept thinking about the strangeness of what they were packing and the fact that he didn't know who they were going with, and now this sudden departure. But again, Chandler just told himself that his parents would be just fine. These are just kind of random anomalies, but they are not indicative of there being any issue here. And so Chandler found a way to just kind of push these concerns out of his mind, and he just went about his day. And so because his parents were now going to be gone for the weekend, he promptly called his girlfriend, Catherine, and asked her to come over and stay at his house with him for a couple of days. And so she comes over, and because Chandler can't really do anything because of his injury, they basically spent the weekend just kind of lounging around and eating nice food and watching Netflix. But by the end of the weekend, on Sunday morning, there was an undertone that both of them noticed that something was wrong. Chandler had told his girlfriend about the strangeness of his parents' quick departure to White Lake, but he had said to her, I'm sure it's fine, and she basically said the same thing, that of course your parents are fine. But by Sunday, Bart and Krista had still not called or texted or checked in with Chandler or Mitchell or anybody. They were just totally gone and silent. And whenever Chandler or Catherine tried calling Bart or Krista's cell phone, it didn't even ring. It just went straight to voicemail. But by late that day, Sunday, July 4th, when really concerns were starting to mount about what happened to Bart and Krista would text her son, Chandler. And what she basically said was, hey, we arrived in White Lake, it's packed here, the service is terrible, but we're going to stick around for the parade, and we'll be back either Monday night or Tuesday early. And so as soon as Chandler and Catherine saw this text message, it was like all their worries were completely gone, and they were just excited to see Bart and Krista when they came back the next day or the day after. But the next day, Monday, Bart and Krista did not come home. They didn't call anyone. They didn't text anyone. And again, whenever anybody tried calling their cell phones, which now was Chandler, Catherine, and also Mitchell, who had been looped in on what's going on with his parents, whenever they tried calling them, Bart and Krista's phone didn't ring. It just went straight to voicemail. And then the day after that, on Tuesday, July 6th, so this was the day that Krista said they would be home by, They didn't come home. And again, no one could get in touch with them. And again, they did not contact anyone. Additionally, on Tuesday, Krista's office began calling Chandler and Mitchell, asking if they knew where Krista was. Krista had recently taken up a customer service job at an auto body shop, and apparently she was scheduled to work on that day, Tuesday the 6th, and she was scheduled to work on that previous Friday, which was the day Bart and Krista left for the lake, meaning she had left on this trip without telling anybody at work. And according to her boss, Krista was the type of person who, even if she was running a couple of minutes late, she would call ahead or text ahead and let people know. So for her to just completely not show up and tell no one was totally out of character. But before Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine could process this information, Bart's employer began calling them, asking the same things. Hey, do you know where Bart is? He's supposed to be working right now, and we can't get in touch with him, and he didn't put in for time off. And so all afternoon on Tuesday the 6th, Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine and other family members are trying to call Bart and Krista. They're calling other people in White Lake to see if anybody knows where they are, but nobody does. And so finally, the next morning on Wednesday, July 7th, when still there was no word from Bart and Krista, Chandler goes to the police and he files a missing person report. And pretty much right away, the police in Windsor contacted the police up north in White Lake and asked them to do a check on this cabin to see if maybe Bart and Krista were there, and maybe they just had terrible service, or maybe there was some sort of accident or something that happened. But when the White Lake police arrived at the Halderson cabin, Bart and Krista were not there. No one was there. In fact, the cabin looked like it had not been used in months. The outside was totally overgrown, and inside there was no food in the fridge. And interestingly, the police would also tell Chandler, Mitchell, and Catherine that there was no damage done to this cabin. There were no broken windows or any sign, at least no obvious sign, of storm damage to this cabin. And so after this revelation, of course, Bart and Krista's family is like, wait a minute, who called them and told them to head up there to fix these obvious broken windows? Are those the same mystery friends that drove them up in the first place? I mean, what's going on here? Was this some sort of trap? Have they been set up? Are they okay? And so by the following day, Thursday, July 8th, when still there was no sign of Bart or Krista and the police really didn't have any new leads to speak of, Chandler was desperate. And so he went to local media and he said, please run a story about my parents and get the word out there that they're missing, and maybe someone knows something and they'll come forward. And so local media, they would do that. They would run this piece. And so while this media coverage is going on the 8th, Chandler would go back to his home and he would hobble door to door asking each of his neighbors if they had a security camera on the front of their house that might have picked up an angle of the street and so may have seen his parents on the morning of July 2nd when they climbed into that mystery couple's car that took them up to White Lake. Chandler was hoping that if he got this footage, somebody would be able to identify who these mystery friends were. But unfortunately, none of his neighbors had that footage. But as it would turn out, it didn't matter, because on that day, the 8th, the police made a discovery that at first seemed relatively minor, relatively small, but when they examined it more closely, they realized it was a huge discovery and it completely broke the case wide open. To understand this breakthrough, we have to go back to June 29th, 2021. So 3 days before Bart and Krista hopped into that mystery person's car and headed up to White Lake. On that day, June 29th, Bart had finally just had it. There had been something bothering him for a really long time, and he had just finally decided, you know what? Today, I'm going to get to the bottom of it. And so Bart pulled out his phone, he punched in a number, he put it to his ear, and after a few rings, a young man named Omar Job answered his call. In total, Bart and Omar would talk on the phone for a total of 17 minutes. And for the first half of the call, it was basically just Bart being really angry and aggressive towards Omar. But then during the second half of the call, when Omar really had a chance to speak for the first time, Bart's tone completely changed. He was no longer angry. He actually sounded totally defeated. And so after this 17-minute phone call finally comes to an end, Bart is left kind of in shock,
but he knows he now needs to set up an even more intense meeting with a group of people, and he needs to tell them what he just learned from Omar. And within 24 hours, Bart had set this additional high-stakes meeting with this other group. It was set for 3 p.m. on July 1st. July 1st was the day before Bart and Krista would leave for White Lake. And so on July 1st, the day of this new pivotal meeting, Bart was working from home, and at some point he looked at his watch and he saw it was just after 2 p.m. And even though this meeting he was going to have was still an hour away, the location of the meeting was a bit of a drive away, and so he knew he needed to leave soon. And so Bart stopped working and he texted Chandler, who was in the house with him. He just said, "Ready to leave when you are." Chandler was aware of how important this meeting was for his dad. He also understood the terrible position his dad was in, and so he had agreed to go with his dad to this meeting. And so after a couple of minutes, both Chandler and Bart have gotten dressed and ready for this meeting, and they met downstairs on the first floor, and after kind of a nod to each other, they begin walking towards the front door. But then something happens. Chandler was standing behind Bart, and so as they're moving towards the door, Chandler reaches out and grabs a rifle he was hiding on the first floor. He raises it and he fires at least 2 shots into his father's back. And then once his father fell to the ground and was either dead or dying, Chandler, calm as can be, pulled out his phone and he texted his mother and told her, "Hey, Dad's phone is dead, so just text me." And then Chandler also sent his mother a text saying, "Get soda on your way home." To which his mother just wrote, "'Kay, I can," smiley face. All Chandler was trying to do was buy as much time as possible to prep the house for his mother's return. And so over the next couple of hours, we don't know exactly what Chandler did, but it's assumed he moved his father's body into some hiding place, and then after maybe trying to clean up a little bit, Chandler laid in wait for his mother. And at 4:58 p.m., Krista would clock out of her job at the automotive shop. She would make a pit stop at a store to buy Chandler some soda, and then between 5:15 and 5:30, security cameras on neighbors' houses would pick her up pulling into her driveway. And then just a couple of minutes later, she walked inside of her beautiful little dream home where she had raised her family over the past couple of decades, only to be immediately gunned down by her son the second she walked inside. It would turn out Chandler was living a double life. He had never graduated from college. He had gone to college, but for like a semester and flunked out. But he just kept telling his friends and family that he was progressing through college and then he graduated from college, all made up. He also did not have a job at the insurance company. He just told his family that he worked from home, which really meant he sat in his room and played video games all day. He was not a rescue scuba diver for the Madison Police Department because 1, he was not a scuba diver, and 2, because the Madison Police Department did not have a rescue scuba diving team. And needless to say, he did not have a job with SpaceX. He had never even applied. As for his head injury, he may have bumped his head at some point, and he did go to the doctors by himself sometime in mid-June, but that doctor just told him he might have a mild concussion and then offered him a neck brace and told him, "You don't need to wear it. That's only if you want to wear it." But then very quickly, Chandler turned this non-injury into a debilitating, crippling, life-altering injury and literally hobbled all around with a neck brace and cane. And the reason he did that is he needed an excuse for why he wasn't starting his job at SpaceX. In short, Chandler lied about virtually every aspect of his life to virtually everyone in his life. And for the most part, people did believe him. However, his parents were becoming more and more suspicious. Specifically, in 2021, he was telling them, "Oh yeah, I'm working at the insurance company," but he never had any money. He could barely pay rent to his family, if at all. And so his dad would say to him, "How is it you are employed but have no money?" And the way Chandler would handle this is he would create fake email accounts pretending to be people in HR at this insurance company, and then acting as them, he would write these convoluted emails that had these ridiculous excuses for why Chandler had not been paid yet. And so he would have that fake email account email his real account. And then Chandler, in his actual email, would write back really angrily and sternly saying, "You gotta fix this, my family's not happy." And then he would once again pretend to be the HR person who would say, "I'm sorry, it's some issue that you can't affect. We're gonna fix it, but you gotta wait." And Chandler would take these exchanges and he would forward them to his father. And while Bart didn't necessarily totally believe what he was being shown, it was enough to get him to stop asking questions. But Bart and Krista were also suspicious of other aspects of Chandler's life, like, for example, his school records. At some point, he needed to show them his transcripts, and he would tell them, "Oh, I can't access my transcripts." And so Bart and Krista are like, "Why? Can't you just log in and pull up your unofficial transcripts at least?" And the way Chandler would handle this was the same way he handled the insurance company. He would create fictitious email accounts of people that were college advisors at Madison College, where he claimed to have gone and graduated from, and he would do those phony back and forths where it looked like the college was telling Chandler, "Sorry, you can't get your transcripts. It's this huge problem that's totally our fault, not yours, but you just gotta wait. There's nothing else you can do. We can't get them for you right now." And when Chandler would send these exchanges to Bart, Bart would get totally worked up about it, and finally he demanded that Chandler give him a phone number so he can talk to one of these college advisors. And so Chandler went out and got a burner phone from a convenience store, and he gave that phone number to his dad, and then when his dad called this number up, somebody picked up, someone introducing themselves as Daniel Spieth, which really was just Chandler disguising his voice. And Daniel Spieth would give Bart the same spiel about how, "Oh, I'm so sorry, it's all the college's fault that we can't get your son's transcripts. You're just gonna have to wait." And so finally, on June 29th, 2021, Bart had just had it with his son. He was convinced his son was lying, or there was something going on. There was just too much about his son's life that didn't add up. And so Bart decided he was just going to call Madison College and pretend to be Chandler and see if he could get his transcripts. And so he dialed a number for customer service at Madison College, and after a few rings, Omar Job, a customer service rep at Madison College, picked up. And initially, Bart was kind of aggressive and mean towards Omar for really no reason other than he was just so frustrated with this whole situation. And so he's on this call pretending to be Chandler, and he's kind of barking at Omar to give me my transcripts right now. I go to your school. There's no reason you can keep them from me. But then after a couple of minutes, Omar finally was able to talk. And he said, "Hey, Chandler, I looked you up in the system and you don't go to this school. You've never gone to this school save for maybe one semester and you failed out." And so it's at this point when Bart hears this that he just pauses for a really long amount of time on this call. And then he begins asking follow-up questions that are not really connected to trying to get transcripts, because now he knows the transcripts don't exist because his son didn't go to school. And so he begins asking Omar, "Does Daniel Spieth still work there?" And so Omar would look him up and he would say, "No, there's no Daniel Spieth that works here, and there's no Daniel Spieth that's ever worked here." And because Chandler had used like 5 or 6 different names when pretending to be college advisors for Madison College, Bart, in addition to asking about that Daniel Spieth guy, asked about every other name he had interacted with, believing he was talking to Madison College. And one by one, Omar told him, "I'm sorry, those people do not work here. I've never heard of these people. They're not in the directory. I'm sorry." And so finally, at the end of that 17-minute call, Bart knew his son was living a huge lie. And so he hung up with Omar, and then Bart called real college advisors at Madison College, and he set a meeting for July 1st at 3 p.m. And then he told Chandler that he had set this meeting, and Chandler was going to come with him, and they together were going to ask those college advisors why they can't produce Chandler's transcripts. Now, Bart, of course, knew Chandler did not have transcripts, and so he likely had set this meeting to get Chandler to call the meeting off and come clean about this big lie so that Bart could get his son back on the right track, stop lying, and live a real life. But the way Chandler handled being caught was not to own up to any of this. He didn't call off the meeting. He just waited until the day of the meeting, and then he killed his father, killed his mother, and then dismembered their bodies and burned their body parts in the family fireplace, including their heads. And then when he couldn't destroy their bodies completely, he took what was left of their remains and scattered them all over town in parks and forests and rivers. He even put his father's headless, armless, legless torso behind his girlfriend's parents' house. And all the while, as he's doing this, he's spinning this ridiculous story to his girlfriend, to his brother, to other members of the Halderson family, to police, to colleagues of Bart and Krista, that Bart and Krista just up and left on the morning of July 2nd with this mystery couple. And oh, by the way, my parents, they were putting cash and silver bars in their luggage. So I don't know, they went up to White Lake and now they're gone. I don't know what happened to them. We don't know why Chandler chose the story he did. It's unclear if he was trying to make it seem like his parents were suspicious and had gotten into something that had maybe gotten them harmed or kidnapped, or if he was trying to make it seem like his parents were just super gullible and had been taken advantage of by this mystery couple. We don't know. He was just trying to make the whole situation seem plausibly suspicious. Ultimately, though, Chandler did so many things that got him caught. From the mountain of physical evidence he left behind inside of his house, where he killed and dismembered his parents, and also at the various dump sites where he didn't even bury the body parts. He would just put them underneath sticks and branches, and so they were very easy to find. To his extremely suspicious behavior on July 7th when he walked into the police station and reported his parents missing. That whole time he was talking to police officers, he was acting so weird and was just saying things that didn't make sense, and he just totally came off like a guy who did not care at all that his parents were gone and really just seemed like a guy who was hiding something. But the big breakthrough that happened on July 8th that broke the case open stemmed from the text message Krista's phone sent to Chandler's phone on July 4th. When Chandler walked into the police station on July 7th and said, "My parents are missing," one of the first questions they had for him was, "Okay, well, when was the last time you spoke to your parents?" And Chandler would tell them he got a text message from his mother, Krista, on Sunday, July 4th. And then he showed them the text message. And the text message said that they had arrived in White Lake and they were going to be sticking around for the parade and they'd be back in a couple of days. But the police noticed that this text message had been sent on July 4th, but in White Lake that year, the parade was on July 3rd. So when this text came through, the parade that anyone in White Lake would be aware of, it's a small place, you're not going to miss this parade, the parade had already happened. So why would Krista be texting her son that she was going to stick around in White Lake for the parade that had already happened? And so this led police to check phone records, and they would discover that text message was sent from Krista's phone to Chandler's phone. But when it was sent on July 4th, Krista's phone was not in White Lake. Instead, it was inside of the Halderson home, right near Chandler's phone. And so when police went to the Halderson house, they searched it and they found Krista's phone in the garage underneath a drawer inside of a shoe wrapped in tinfoil next to her driver's license. And so Chandler had obviously sent that text message on July 4th using his mother's phone to himself. But he had just gotten the date wrong of the parade. And so this discrepancy really opened up the floodgates, and before long, it was beyond obvious that Chandler was the killer. And after a thorough investigation, it was determined that Chandler had acted entirely alone, meaning Catherine, his girlfriend, and his brother Mitchell had nothing to do with it. They were just innocent bystanders. Chandler would ultimately be found guilty of killing his parents, and he would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chandler has still not taken any responsibility for what he's done. Instead, he just tells anybody who will listen that his plan is to continue to appeal his verdict. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button is in a deep sleep, put a wig on them along with a mustache beard combo, and then decorate their bedroom to look like a hospital suite, and then violently shake them awake and tell them they've been in a medically induced coma for years. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new stories on Monday mornings, and we put out remasters of our best YouTube audio on Thursday mornings. That podcast is available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, basically anywhere you can find podcasts, you can find this one. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crime.